Kia ora, welcome. Come on in. Come and join us for our Giving Tuesday inside the global food crisis. Good evening. Hi, everyone. Kia ora, haere mai. Come on in. Join us for our excellent webinar that's about to begin. Haere mai, everyone. Come on in. Kia ora, good evening, haere mai, and welcome to our Giving Tuesday webinar, Inside the Global Food Crisis. My name is Amy Richardson, Save the Children New Zealand's Communications Director. I'd like to start by thanking you at home for joining us and helping support the work we're doing at home in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and around the world to help improve the lives of children. We're especially grateful for those of you in Auckland joining us on what will be day 105, I think, of level 3 lockdown. I know it's still an uncertain and anxious time for many of us, so we're extremely pleased that you've been able to join us tonight. Now, a bit of housekeeping. We may find that we experience more connection issues than usual due to more of us being at home, so please be patient. And if you find yourself cut off at any point, just click on the same link that got you here and you'll find your way back to us. I'd like to start by inviting you to tell us where you are joining us from tonight. Welcome everyone. Put where you've come from in our chat and we'd love to say hi. We are delighted to have economics expert Professor Stephen Knowles from the University of Otago joining us tonight. He's here to take us inside some of the reasons behind poverty and the global food crisis and the impact of COVID-19 and climate change on developing countries. Stephen is joined by our very own Save the Children New Zealand Chief Executive, Hedi Koetzee, who will talk about what we're doing with the support of people like you to effect change. About how with your contribution, we're able to put food on the table for people like Kainab, whose young twins, Salma and Saeed, are so hungry, they're getting sick. As a mum myself, I can't imagine how hard it must be to watch your own children go hungry. Before we get started, I'd like to begin by directing you to our donate link that should be in your chat now, thanks to our lovely tech guru, Kat. This is a way that you can help us reach more families in need. And given that it's Giving Tuesday, it's the perfect time to get in behind us and support us. And we're so grateful for everything you do. If you could please check that the link is working by clicking on it and let us know. If someone's on Safari, Chrome, Firefox, please let us know in the chat. The chat is also where you can let us know if you experience any technical problems. Because connectivity can be an issue, we may lose some of our guests at various points, but hopefully not, fingers crossed. So please be patient, and if you have any problems at all, don't hesitate to contact us via email or jump back on the link. Let us know in the chat if you can't hear anyone, or just Q&A. There's lots of ways to get hold of us. If you're joining us from Facebook Live, feel free to comment as well, and we'll try and sort it out as quickly as we can. If you'd like to ask questions along the way, we'd love to have them. Please use the Q&A on your Zoom link. And if you're joining us from Facebook Live, please use the comments feature or DM us any questions you have. Now let me introduce you to our panellists. First up is Professor Stephen Knowles. For much of Stephen's research career, he used cross-country data to analyse why some countries are poorer than others, focusing especially on the importance of education, health, inequality, institutions, and social capital in the economic development process. In recent years, he has analysed people's preferences for the types of countries they think foreign aid should be targeted to. Stephen is a former head of the economics department at Otago University and former president of the New Zealand Association of Economists. And currently, we're very lucky to have him here tonight online with us. Ngā mihi, and thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. And our own Heidi. Save the Children founder, Eglantine Jebb, had an unwavering belief that humanity owes the child the best that it has to give, a statement that still informs and inspires the work and decision-making of our chief executive every day. Now I'm going to switch my screen off and hand you over to Stephen. Stephen, you can unmute yourself now, who will begin our webinar taking you inside the global food crisis.
Well, thank you, Amy, and kia ora, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be taking part in this webinar this evening. I've really been looking forward to this since I was invited to do it. Just to get us started, I've got a question for you all to ponder as soon as I get this working. Brilliant, technology is working. So a question to think about. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has, and this is multi-choice, so option A is that it's almost doubled, B, that it's remained more or less the same, or C, that it's almost halved. And I might pause for 5 seconds or so and just let you think about what the answer to that question might be. Now, if you're anything like other people that have typically been asked this question, and there's a famous public health guy, Hans Rowling, that's travelled the world asking this question, most people give option A. They think that poverty has almost doubled in the last 20 years. But in fact, the good news is the correct answer is actually C. Global poverty has halved in the last couple of decades or so. And the United Nations had Millennium Development Goals, the key one of which was to halve global poverty by 2015. And that goal was achieved worldwide, and it was achieved in every geographic region apart from Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what happened in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the reason I like to ask this question is it demonstrates a very important point, that life in the poorest countries in the world, it's tough, it's really tough. But actually things are getting better. And that shows that, efforts that have been made over the last few decades to try and improve the lives of people in these countries, there's evidence that it's working. And that's an important thing to remember. But what do we mean here when we talk about extreme poverty? How is that actually measured? Well, this is the World Bank's poverty line, which is set at $1.90 a day in international dollars. And to think of this in terms of New Zealand dollars, this would be, in today's money, about $2.50 a day. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, $2.50 a day, that doesn't sound very much, but things are probably cheaper in the poorest parts of the world, such as Africa, so that money would probably go further. But actually, these poverty lines are set to take those purchasing power differences into account. So someone living on this World Bank poverty line, to figure out how much that would be, think of what we can buy for $2.50 in New Zealand, and that's the consumption that those people are having to get by on. And speaking of that poverty line, I remember, I think it was back in 2014, there were a number of New Zealand charities taking part in what was called the Live Below the Line Challenge, encouraging New Zealanders as a fundraiser to try and live on $2.50 a week, $2.50 a day on the amount of food that they spent on food, and to try and do that for 5 days. And my wife and I both took part in that. And I did manage for 5 days to spend not more than $2.50 on food. It was pretty basic food. I got pretty hungry, had to use cheaper tea bags than normal. That wasn't much fun. But I remember saying to a workmate of mine at the time that I was doing this and I was managing to spend only $2.50 a day on food. And he said to me, "How did you get to work today?" And I said, "I drove." And he said, "Well, actually, if you were really trying to survive on that amount of money, $2.50 is not just what you've got for food, it's what you've got for everything. You wouldn't have been able to afford the petrol. So this is a very extreme form of poverty here that we're talking about. Now, to give you an idea of the parts of the world where extreme poverty is the highest, we've got this map of the world here, and the darker the colour, the higher the rate of extreme poverty. So these countries with the very dark shade of red here, those are countries where more than half of the population are living on less than that $1.90 a day, or $2.50 a day in terms of New Zealand money. And we can see that the countries where absolute poverty is the highest are those that are in Africa, and there's also some in South Asia as well. But this poverty is concentrated a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm aware that what we're focusing on tonight is more about malnutrition and food insecurity and the food crisis. So here's another map of the world to look at. And again, it's the same idea. The darker the colour, the darkest colour being here, the higher the degree of malnutrition. So these countries in the middle of Africa and also Madagascar, that's where malnutrition is more than 35%. And I'm going to quickly flick between these two slides. And the point that I want to demonstrate is the countries where malnutrition is high is also the countries where there's a lot of people living below that poverty line. And that's not surprising, because food expenditure is going to make up the lion's share of the money that those people have available to spend. Now, here's a graph to have a wee look at, and I want us to zero in on what's shown by this red arrow here. So this is data for sub-Saharan Africa, and this here is the $1.90 a day poverty line, and we're looking at what's happened to it over time. And the Millennium Development Goal was to halve poverty between 1990 and 2015 in here, and sub-Saharan Africa didn't quite achieve that. But poverty did fall, but just by not as much as we would have liked it to. And you can see here that there's this little increase here, and that's not based on actual data. That's just a projection on what would happen if incomes in Africa fell on average by 5% as a result of the COVID crisis. And what we can see is that would mean an increase in the number of people living below the poverty line. And that would take us back to about where we were here about 2012. So it would set progress back about 10 years in terms of reducing poverty. Now, the good news is that was based on what would happen if African economies contracted by 5%. The good news is they didn't. On average, African economies contracted by about 2% in 2020. And the expectation is that they'll actually grow by about 3% this year. So by the end of this year, we'll get back to where we were by the end of 2019. Now, I've mentioned COVID. What's the impact of COVID been on the food crisis? Well, the bad news is that across the developing world, many households report eating fewer meals or smaller portions in order to cope with the crisis. And this is based on surveys done of tens of thousands of different households, asking them about what's happened. And we can see that, for example, in rural households in Kenya, 48% of them report eating fewer meals or smaller portions. And the number's higher at 87% in Sierra Leone. And I've given the numbers there for some other countries as well. I was only a few days ago reading some information the World Bank put out a couple of weeks ago on what they think has been happening to global hunger as a result of COVID. So this is very up-to-date information. And I'm just going to put a couple of quotes up here for what the World Bank had to say. So they noted that many countries are facing growing levels of acute food insecurity, reversing years of development gains. So that's troubling. And they also noticed that reduced calorie intake and comprised nutrition threaten gains in poverty reduction and health, and could have lasting impacts on the cognitive development of young children. So that's pretty worrying too. And they also note that prior to COVID, although COVID's obviously made things worse, that acute hunger had actually been on the rise for a little bit due to conflict. And I was trying to find some numbers about the extent of conflict in Africa, and the most recent numbers I could find was for 2019, where there was armed conflict going on in 19 countries in Africa. Natural hazards have also been causing this increase in acute hunger. And of course, climate change has been a really big issue as well. And particularly in the more arid and semi-arid countries, climate change is having a huge impact on the amount of food that those countries can produce. And pests are more prevalent than they once were, and that's having an impact on food production as well. So that's the impact of COVID. I guess the question I want to go back to now is to think about, well, why is it that poverty is so much higher in some countries than others? And it's not a recent phenomenon that poverty has been high in Africa and other parts of the developing world compared to New Zealand where we live. It's been the case for a very, very long time. So why is that? And obviously in the time that I've got available, we can't go into lots and lots of arguments. So I'm just going to cherry pick a few. But the first point I want to note is that it would be overly simplistic to just blame high population growth for this. So population growth is high in Africa. It is falling. It's a lot less than what it was 2 or 3 decades ago. But high population growth is generally thought to be a symptom of poverty, not a cause of poverty. So it's not high population growth that's causing lots of people to be living in poverty. People living in poverty end up having lots of children in order to be able to support themselves. So what are some different arguments then as to why historically we've got this group of rich countries and we've got poor countries in our midst? And one argument that I find really interesting is to do with geography, and it's an argument from Jared Diamond. He's pictured there on the slide, and he sets out this argument in his famous book, Guns, Germs and Steel. Now, it's quite a thick book, and if I've whetted your appetite to find out more about this when I've talked about it soon, National Geographic did put out a TV series called Guns, Germs and Steel. There's 3 episodes, and last time I checked, you could find it on YouTube. But what's the argument? Well, Diamond argues we've got to go back in history about 11,000 years. And if we go back 11,000 years, this takes us to a point in time where everybody was a hunter-gatherer. So there was no settled farming. We didn't have domestication of plants and animals. But that all changed when the Neolithic Revolution came to the Fertile Crescent about 11,000 years ago. And this slide here shows where the Fertile Crescent is. So, it's Egypt on the banks of the Nile into Palestine, and also these river systems here in what we would call modern day Iraq. And it would surprise us now thinking of this being an area of high agricultural productivity, but things have changed over time. So this is where settled farming began, where people started farming animals, they domesticated animals, and they also domesticated a number of crops. And this meant that rather than people traveling around hunting and gathering, they could stay in one place and they could farm. And the advantage of this is that productivity from settled farming or sedentary farming is higher than being a hunter-gatherer. So these societies didn't need to have everyone spending all their time farming. Some people could specialize in other things, such as building houses or making clothes or being soldiers or inventing new things like writing and stuff like that. So the idea is that the longer ago in a part of the world the Neolithic Revolution happened, the more developed we would expect that economy to be, because a very basic form of economic development started when these areas started practicing domestication of plants and animals. So where did this spread to out of the Fertile Crescent? Well, if we have a look at this map here, here's the Fertile Crescent in here. And the domestication of animals and plants was able to spread west into Europe and east into Asia, but not down into Africa. And the reason for that is the sorts of crops that would grow well in the Fertile Crescent, they will grow well in other places with a similar climate. That's in places with similar latitudes. And the latitude's very different down here in Central Africa than it is up here. So the Neolithic Revolution spread into Europe, but not into Africa. Now, Africa had its own Neolithic revolution many millennia later, but that meant that around about 1500, when Europeans started to try and conquer the rest of the world, Europe was far more advanced in an economic and military sense than were places like Africa and the Americas. And a point to note from all of this is that if Jared Diamond's story can help explain why some parts of the world became rich and others poor, it's just due to geographic accident. It's not the fault of the people living in these poorer parts of the world that that they are poor. Now, of course, there are many other arguments as to why some parts of the world have ended up poorer than others. And just to talk about one person who's talked about this, so Paul Collier has a famous book called The Bottom Billion, which is shown on the slide there, along with a photo of Paul Collier. And when he refers to the bottom billion, he means the billion poorest people in the world. And he talks about the fact that these people tend to live in countries that are suffering from one of four types of traps. So they're trapped in poverty due to either conflict. And we've noted that now Africa is a part of the world that knows conflict. Also poor governance, and that's tied up with having poor political institutions. And another sort of famous story about institutions that's down to the economists Azimoglu, Johnson and Robinson. They argue that the sorts of institutions developing countries have today, or parts of the world that were colonized by Europeans, the sorts of institutions they have today goes back to the colonial era. And in parts of the world where Europeans settled in large numbers, so I think Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, if there were a large number of Europeans settling there, then good quality institutions were set up that protected private property and encouraged economic activity. But in parts of the world where the Europeans went to, but their main intention was to extract resources as quickly from those lands as they could, they set up institutions geared for that, not for promoting economic development of the masses. And when those colonial powers left, those poor institutions remained. Another point that Collier talks about is the natural resource curse. And we might think that if you have an abundance of natural resources like oil or diamonds, that this would be a good thing. But actually, history shows it can be a bad thing. And the reason for that is that it leads to people fighting over control of these resources. If you have a country like Sierra Leone that has a lot of diamonds, then you'll have people wanting to get political control so they can grab the diamonds for themselves. So having natural resources typically does not lead to economic development. And another problem identified by Collier is that of being landlocked, that is being surrounded by other countries and having no access to the sea. And the problem with that is it then becomes difficult to trade with the rest of the world. And it's richer countries you might want to trade with. If your neighbours are poor, there's not much future in trading with them. So that's just a sort of 10-minute look or so at some of the stories out there as to why it might be that the poor countries have ended up the way that they have. But the really key point I want to emphasise is it's not their fault that they're poor. All of these different arguments that we've been through are really just a result of historical accident. It's not that people living there are lazy or anything like that. They were just born in a country where they're not as fortunate as we are. Now, of course, if we're wanting to think about what can we do about this and how can aid help, the elephant in the room might be this question, does aid really work? And Dambisa Moyo, a photo of whom is shown on the screen there, she's famously argued that Africa has received $1 trillion in aid and has very little to show for it. And she's made these arguments in her book, Dead Aid, a picture of which is shown there on the screen. Now, the economist and philosopher Will MacAskill, I think, has done a great job of critiquing the statement there by Dambisa Moyo. And the points that he's picked on, I've highlighted there in red. So the first point is there's been $1 trillion in aid given to Africa. Well, over 60 years, that's true. And that sounds like a lot of money. But if we break it down, over 60 years and 412 million people, that's actually only $40 per year per person, which suddenly just doesn't seem so much anymore. But what about this other argument that there's little to show for this money that's been spent? Well, actually, there's a lot to show for what's been achieved. You know, for example, in 1950, life expectancy in Africa was 36.7 years. It's now 56, or it was when MacAskill made this argument. It's even higher now. And to give a specific health intervention that's worked really well, smallpox was eradicated in 1977. And that was in part due to foreign aid, with those efforts being led by the World Health Organization. And this is huge because prior to its eradication, this caused 1.5 to 3 million deaths per year. And this is, these are deaths that we no longer get, in part due to foreign aid. And of course, as we looked at earlier, the number of people living in poverty in Africa has been falling over time as well. Perhaps not as quickly as we'd like, but it has been falling. Now, something I should really emphasize is that most of the aid critics out there, and Bill Easterly is another one, they're focusing their arguments mainly on government-to-government aid, not the sort of aid where individuals like us give money to save the children, who work with people on the ground who know well how to spend that money. So this critique is typically not aimed at organisations like Save the Children anyway. And there's lots of evidence out there from randomised controlled trials that the sorts of interventions that agencies like Save the Children get involved in really do work in terms of improving the lives of people living in the world's poorest countries. So just to end, a point I want to highlight is that a donation to Save the Children is highly cost effective. What I mean by that is that you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. And there's a lot of great charities out there in New Zealand doing great work helping people in need in New Zealand, and that's fantastic. But when you give money to an international development charity like Save the Children, your donation is very probably going to achieve more than it could in New Zealand. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, there's much greater need in developing countries overseas. So that means there's more what we economists call low-hanging fruit to pick. And what we mean by low-hanging fruit is stuff that's actually really quite easy to do. And to give some examples of this, so leprosy, a terrible disease, but the medicine exists these days to cure it relatively easily, and it doesn't cost that much either. Now, we don't have leprosy in New Zealand, so it's not a problem we have to worry about solving here, but donations to organisations working on that can achieve a lot. So that's just one example, and I could give others, but in the interests of time, I won't. But the other point is that most things, including food, and we're here to talk about food tonight, cost a lot less in developing countries than in New Zealand. So to feed a family for a month in Africa costs a lot less money in New Zealand dollar terms than it would to feed a family for a month in New Zealand. So you're going to get a lot of great stuff, a lot of bang for your buck for supporting a charity like Save the Children and its fundraising efforts this evening. And then the final point I want to end with is this: don't be overwhelmed by statistics on how bad hunger is. It would be easy to look at some of the stuff I've talked about so far tonight and think there's so many people hungry in the developing world. What could I do to solve that? Well, instead of thinking like that, I would suggest that maybe just think about the one family that you can help. Or maybe, if you've got a bit of extra money, the two families that you can help. And if enough people think that way, then we can start to see real change. So that's all I had to say. And I guess we go back now to Amy.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really, really interesting. I'm going to take some questions for Stephen. So if you've got any, just pop them into the Q&A. But before we move on, I'd like to remind you how you can help in this global hunger crisis. Please donate by clicking on the link in our chat that's just coming up now. For anyone just joining us, we're going to take some questions from home. If you'd like to send us anything, you can use the Q&A option, or from Facebook Live, comment on the link, or send us a direct message. So I've got a question here. Is there anything, Stephen, that has surprised you during your time researching poverty? Is there anything that's really surprised you?
Yep. So one thing I think that surprised me, and this isn't research I've done, but there's lots of mounting evidence these days that if we want to help people in the developing world to improve their lives, one of the best things we can do is simply give them money. And the technical term for that is an unconditional cash transfer. And it would be tempting to think, oh, we shouldn't do that because people might go away and waste the money on cigarettes or alcohol or something like that. And you can always find anecdotal examples of a very, very small number of people who do waste the money like that, but the vast majority don't. And some of the current thinking in development economics is, if we look at what are the best interventions to reduce poverty in the developing world, those unconditional cash transfers, which I understand save the children involved in to some extent, that is one of the things that can achieve a lot.
Sorry, I just was muted. What has been some of the, from a personal point of view during your career, what have been some of the big achievements that you've felt have made a real difference and contribution to this work?
Oh gosh, that's a really big question. I mean, it's easy to work away in the ivory tower and worry that nobody actually reads the stuff that you write and that it doesn't have a lot of impact. But actually, more recently in my research career, I've been doing research on why it is that people do or don't donate to international development charities. And that's sort of given me the opportunity to get involved in doing things like this tonight. And in some ways, that's been some of the most rewarding stuff that I've done in my academic career.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions for you, Heidi, actually, before we get started, because they've just come in. So one of the questions is, how does Save the Children get around corrupt governments, things like bribes, siphoning aid? Is there a particular thing that you do to avoid this, or how does it work?
Unmuting myself first. Yeah, very good question, Amy. So when we work and deliver aid in a country, we actually do it from a Save the Children office to a Save the Children office. So we don't actually put money into governments and country at all. So our work is independent from governments.
And so that's how also, because one of the other questions is, how do aid agencies ensure food gets to the families where there is conflict?
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's our own staff that actually work in those areas and deliver the need or assistance that's needed, or we work with local NGOs that are already within the communities to deliver, the services.
That's great. Thank you, Heidi. There's one last question for you. How much does it cost to support families for a month, say in New Zealand dollars? Do you have any idea?
Gosh, let me just pull up my file here. I would say, so what I do know is $56 could provide a family with a cash grant so they can buy essential food items. And being an African myself, I would say that's probably a week worth of food.
Great. There was just a follow-up question to the one around corrupt governments. Do governments accept that, sort of bypassing them, I guess?
Yeah, and look, that's a lot of relationship building between Save the Children and the government to make sure that we can, deliver the programs that we do want to deliver. But that doesn't mean we pass the money through them.
I'm going to say that people like you at home have made a huge difference to us in the work we do around the world. In fact, I know that as of this afternoon, our appeal, this appeal that we're talking about, was sitting at just over 195,000 New Zealand dollars from a generous 1,422 supporters. So thank you so much. This money will go towards feeding families like Caleb's. Our target is to reach $220,000, and we hope that tonight on Giving Tuesday we might get a little bit closer to that number. Heidi, I'm going to hand over to you now for you to share more about how Save the Children is working to not only make a difference with providing food and other services, but also helping to build capacity in the Pacific through its livelihood projects. Thanks so much, Heidi.
Thank you, Amy. Like Amy said, I'm Hedi Kozier, and from the accent, you can hear that I was born in South Africa. And sometimes I apologize and say sorry for the accent. I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk to you about an issue that is close to my heart. It is this global hunger crisis and how we can make a difference. Thank you, Stephen, so much for your input tonight. As you said, these issues are complex, they're historic, and there's sadly no quick fix to them at all. And when we put together this webinar, Amy said to me, so, how do you relate this to growing up in South Africa? And the one thing that sticks in my mind is that there's such a big difference between the haves and the have-nots. On the one side of the road are wealth, good lives, and in some cases mansions. And on the other side of the road, utter poverty and despair. I grew up in Johannesburg, and there's the Henops River. And I remember every year when the rainy season would come, these shacks that people live in would be washed away. And they would rebuild those shacks exactly in the same place. And people would go, but why? It's close to the river. They don't have to walk too far after a long day at work to actually get water. And so ultimately for me, it's about the roll of the dice. It could easily have been you and me in that situation. Right, we can move on to slide 2. I've got Stephen driving my slides for me, so thank you very much. Life is not easy when you're born hungry, and those affected most are our children. So I'm going to play you, or Stephen's going to play you a little video.
गांव में जन्म ली थी तो बोले एकदम कांडी जैसे थी
I think we might have to look at the sound of the videos. I think something's gone wrong there.
We're not able to hear that?
No. So I don't know if someone on the chat can just indicate if you could hear that, that would be great. It might just be me. No. Right, I wonder if we reshare, Stephen, and we just click those 2 buttons and see if we can replay that video. Offering issue. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how we do that, but I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
And so what are the 2 buttons that we click?
So when you share at the bottom, Peter, you can hear fantastic.
When I go share screen.
There's 2, at the bottom, there's two little boxes.
Oh, share sound.
There we go.
Optimize for video clip. Right, do you want me to play that again, Heidi?
I would like that. That is stylefully done. Thank you, Stephen.
چون 5 میشه ترکاری گوشتی چیزا نخوریم شبانه میشه کم میشه و روزا نان خشک میخوریم نان خشکم نباشه همطور میشنیم گشنگی هم خوابیم
अभी मैं नन्ना मेरा गांव में थी गांव में जन्म ली थी तो बोले वो एकदम कांडी जैसे थी
subaxdii maxay tiri markan waxay tiraahdaa waxa wada wadka wareeysa wax ku warwaadeen wax kugu farmaayo yarta shuushad bay ugu furanta
So that time we had sound but no image. I think was the issue. I think we need, it's not in presentation mode anymore, Stephen, so sorry, I think, but that's all right. I think that I think everyone's had a taste of that one.
Taste, fantastic. So, right, so some of you might have received my letter that looked like this, about children like Salma and Saeed in Somalia. But for those who didn't, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the children facing one of the world's biggest hunger crises. So when their mother Kainab visited the Save the Children clinic, she was feeling hopeless. Her children had never known anything but hunger. She used to raise camels and goats, which provided some milk for her children, but drought after drought and a swarm of locusts basically killed off her livestock, which left them with nothing. Families like Kainab's have experienced an increasing number of climate-related disasters over the last few decades, ranging from long-lasting droughts, devastating floods, infestations, cyclones, and sometimes all of this in just one region. So this global climate crisis has led to food insecurity, a heightened risk of famine, increased water shortages, widespread disease outbreak, displacement and drastic reduction of household incomes. Children and their families cannot cope and don't have time actually to recover in between these disasters. So can we move on to slide 3? Yep, we're on slide 3. So just as we said, don't look at the picture.
I'm just going to interrupt for a sec. Oh. Stephen, you'll have to reshare because it's still not in presenter mode. So,
yep. So we'll do this again, and I think it's going to be a case of sharing the correct screen. So
thank you.
Bear with me. Right, is that in slideshow mode?
That's right, thank you. And no matter how many times we practiced it, you know, there'll be a gremlin somewhere in the works. So thank you for your patience online. And just as we said, don't focus on the big numbers. Here is some big numbers and statistics, but think of this as Kainab and her family. You know, with an estimated 5.7 million children under 5 on the brink of starvation across the globe and a further 13 million facing extreme food shortages, the world is facing the biggest crisis of the 21st century. So for the first time in decades, like Stephen said, we're moving backward because of this combination of COVID, climate, and conflict. And this is pushing hunger and malnutrition levels to a new high. So we can move to slide 4. So children going hungry isn't new. What is new is some of the reasons for it. So suddenly we have pandemics, climate change, you know, and conflict is much more than it used to be. And this is pushing back the gains we've made. But we continue to work to make a difference. Around the world, we're reaching millions of children through our work that provide malnutrition screening, cash transfers like Stephen said, vitamin supplements, breastfeeding support, and counselling. So the money raised here tonight will go towards our work in the Horn of Africa, and in particular Somalia, where we've got a program running at the moment. So this is for a current crisis. What we also do at Save the Children is we work alongside our partners and with the government here in New Zealand, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and our local communities in Fiji, Cambodia, and Nepal to enable long-term change through our livelihoods projects. So our livelihood projects actually aim to help families move beyond just subsistence farming and to creating small businesses. This means that we work with the farmers on actually farming techniques, supplier management, and market access. And all the excess crop that they grow on their farms can now be sold at great prices, and that generates additional income for families. The great thing about this is it provides choice. It provides choice to these families about where they put their money. And we know that they put it towards the education of their children, to nutrition, healthcare, and even financial freedom, so paying off debts. We also know families who have more money available to them actually put money without fail towards the education of their children. So I'd like to share two of the projects that we've got currently running, the one in Cambodia and one in Nepal. So if we can move to the next slide. This project is in Coetzee province and started in 2017. So it's great to see this video of what's happened in the meantime since we've been there.
So play the video, Heidi.
Absolutely.
មុនដំបូងខ្ញុំដាំតាមរបៀបទម្លាប់ចាស់របស់ខ្ញុំដាំដោយពុំមានបច្ចេកទេសគ្រប់គ្រាន់ហើយខ្វះសម្ភារៈកសិកម្មហើយការដែលខ្ញុំដាំហ្នឹងគឺទទួលបានផលតិចតួចផលដែលទទួលបានគឺថាវាមិនសមនឹងការដែលចំណាយកម្លាំងពលកម្មចំណេញតិចការដំបូងគឺថាអត់ទាន់ជឿ 100% ទេតែដាក់ចិត្តថាចូលរួមឲ្យដឹងមួយគម្រោងសិន ដល់តែធ្វើបានផលជាក់ស្ដែងឃើញនឹងខ្លួនឯងផ្ទាល់បានចាប់ដើមជឿហើយផ្សព្វផ្សាយបន្តឲ្យកសិករផ្សេងទៀតគាត់យល់ឃើញឲ្យគាត់ជឿដូចគ្នាដែរ របស់ខ្ញុំនិយាយទៅគឺថាញ៉ាំទៅវាមិនប៉ះពាល់ដល់សុខភាពទេបើយើងដាំតាមគោលការណ៍សុវត្ថិភាពយើងការប្រើប្រាស់ថ្នាំកសិកម្មហ្នឹងគឺធ្វើទៅតាមគ្រូបច្ចេកទេសណែនាំប្រើតាមដំណាក់កាលមួយទៅដំណាក់កាលមួយដល់ពេលប្រើរយៈពេលពីតសក់បានផលផ្លែអីហ្នឹងចាប់យើងលែងប្រើអ្វីទាំងអស់យើងគ្រាន់តែប្រើកម្មវិធីជីបញ្ចូលអីតាមប្រព័ន្ធដំណក់ទឹកធម្មតា ដល់ពេលឥឡូវឃើញថាមិនសូវព្រួយបារម្ភរឿងការលក់ដូរទេវាឃើញថាវាទីផ្សារឥឡូវវាទូលំទូលាយហើយគេមានគេស្គាល់យើងច្រើនស្គាល់ផលិតផលរបស់យើងអីចឹងទៅគឺថាវាស្រួលមានតសក់អីចឹងម៉ួយគាត់មកកំងអីចឹងគាត់យកអស់មិនដែលសល់ទេថ្នាក់ពេលខ្លះរកតសក់លក់ឲ្យគាត់អត់បានផងតែកូនខ្ញុំបានទៅរៀនទៀងទាត់ហើយមានលុយ អីឲ្យគាត់ពុតគង់ការសិក្សាអីហើយមានអាហារូបត្ថម្ភឲ្យគាត់នឹងបានហូបចុកគ្រប់គ្រាន់ច្រើនល្អប្រសើរជាងមុនឥឡូវបានធ្វើការជាមួយគម្រោងឃើញថាជីវភាពគ្រួសារមិនថាកូនមិនថាគ្រួសារខ្លួនឯងមានជីវភាពធូរធារក្រាន់បើជាងមុនមួយកម្រិត
So the cucumber story is definitely one of the favorites in the office. One of those that after 7 years at Save the Children sticks out definitely as a favorite for myself. The cucumber farming has been so successful that the farmers now supply their local markets and they don't rely on imports from Thailand anymore, which is fantastic for, you know, what he talked about, growing his own income. And some farmers have also been able to diversify into new smaller businesses. Like one of the farmers actually got a small grant from Save the Children and bought a mulching machine and is now doing coconut mulching and selling this as compost, which is fantastic. Can we move to the next slide, please? And lastly, this is a project in Udaipur in Nepal, and this is one of those projects that I remember from the very first day I think that I started at Save the Children New Zealand. So it's been with us for a while, and I'd love to show you this video.
The project aims to build the capacity of farmers to invest in a quality education, health and nutrition of their children through improved household food security and income. The project has formed 71 farmers group in our working area with a total of 1,114 farmers. The project has supported improved variety of seed, climate smart agriculture technology like polyhouse, drip irrigation, water harvesting pond, mulching sprayer, and nursery tray for producing seed sapling. 2020, we experimented with akawari chili farming, a variety of hot pepper in our one project area. It was a success. In 2021, more than 150 farmers are growing this variety and earning from 1,400 New Zealand dollar to 5,600 New Zealand dollar in our season of 4 months.
Thank you. And just some of the wins out of this project is that these farmer groups have been able to actually advocate for themselves, very similar to the Farmers Federation here in New Zealand, meaning they can negotiate better prices from their suppliers or talk to local government. And then, as you've seen in the video, they've been able to actually come together as a collective, put together their produce and actually demand much higher prices at the market for their goods, which you can see, returns a lot more money to the individual farmers. So we are currently building collection centres with the farmers to make this much more easier. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about what we do. I'll hand over back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I've got a few questions coming in and I'd love more, so just feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A. But I've got one for you, Heidi, around what do you know are some of the long-term impacts on children who are experiencing hunger or grow up where food insecurity is an issue?
Sure. Well, one of them is we know that they don't do well at school. That's if they make it to school at all, for one. And then especially for girls, so families that really struggle tend to marry off their daughters at a much younger age. So they have a lot more, they'll never have that education or be able to make good decisions for their families. So some really dire impacts for children, if hunger is something that they deal with.
One of the things that is often said, and Stephen actually raised this earlier too, around, how do we know that the money, for instance, cash transfers, is being spent on improving the lives of the families, and how do we know that money is getting to children?
I think we know that through years of working with families, and we know that the money goes, like I said earlier, that it gives them choice. And the first choice they normally make is to put it into the children's education, because they know that is what buys a better future for their children. So they make better decisions about nutrition, healthcare, So we know that from working with years, over years and years with families.
And do you check and monitor progress of your programs, and how are all the checks and balances in place to ensure that the money that you raise from Kiwis here at home is going into the programs that you're wanting it to go into?
Absolutely. So yes, we actually do monitor. So we've got a great team called the International Programming team, and part of their job is to go and visit our programs once a year and actually our communities to see exactly what's happened. So it's a bit of the boring stuff and checking in, our due diligence in the back office, but they get that amazing opportunity to go and meet our communities at the same time.
How do you select the families or the projects that you support?
That's actually done with our local partners. So they know their communities very well and have built up relationships with certain communities over time. So they know exactly where the needs are, and they also work, with their local governments or national governments to actually look at where the biggest need is before a decision is made as to where we will invest the money. We also look at what other NGOs are delivering work in the same areas so that we don't double up on the same effort.
What is it like to be the chief executive of Save the Children, and what are some of your proudest moments that you've had?
Gosh, it's quite an emotional job. So it's great to be at the head of an organisation that speaks for children when we know children can't always speak for themselves. So it's a huge privilege for one, but a huge responsibility, because I truly believe that each of us as adults have an opportunity to make a difference. We just have a great organisation that stands behind it. One of the moments that sticks with me is when I visited a community in Fiji, and we had disaster risk reduction clubs. And it's a big word for basically teaching children what to happen when disaster comes. And these little children couldn't speak English. But by the end of it, what I knew was when the tsunami came, we had to go up that hill, and they had me by the hand and dragging me basically to show me this is where we need to go. And how proud they were of where they lived. And that will stick with me for the rest of my life, is how proud these children are of their communities, no matter how impoverished they are. It's their communities and they love it. And we have made a difference in their world. Yeah.
Stephen, I've got one last question for you. What do you think is the one thing that there's not one thing, I'm sure, but what is one of the things that we can do to help improve world hunger, the world hunger crisis?
Well, I guess the obvious thing is to support charities like Save the Children that are doing really great work to try and make a difference. The other one would be to try and bring political pressure to bear for the New Zealand government to actually spend a bit more money on foreign aid. So the United Nations has a target of the developed countries all spending 0.7% of their GNP on aid. And New Zealand falls well short of that. I think the current figure is like 0.3. So we're giving about half of the money in foreign aid that we should as a developed country. And if the New Zealand government was to give more, that would certainly make a big difference too. But the obvious thing we can do as individuals is to keep supporting charities like Save the Children.
Thank you both so much. Is there any, if there's any other last questions, pop them into the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Heidi and Stephen so much for your time tonight, and thank you all at home for joining us. I'd also like to remind you how you can help in this global hunger crisis this Giving Tuesday. Today is the day, and you can donate by clicking on the link that's in the chat. You can go to our website, savethechildren.org.nz, and yeah, any contribution makes a huge difference, as Stephen has identified. We'll be sending out a recording of the event to our supporters, and you'll also be able to find it on our Facebook page at Save the Children NZ. So thank you again so much. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.